The hot July sun beat down on London's busy streets as tourists from around the world walked through the famous city. Among them was a man who stood out from everyone else. His name was Rick, a 45-year-old construction worker from Texas who had never been outside America before. This was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, but Rick had his own ideas about how to spend his time in England. Rick wore his bright red hat with pride, along with a shirt covered in American flag designs. His backpack had patches and pins showing his political views. People on the street couldn't help but notice him. Some smiled politely, others just stared, but Rick didn't seem to care. In fact, he liked the attention. Walking beside him was his wife Linda, a quiet woman who worked as a teacher back home. She had been looking forward to this vacation for months. Linda had read guidebooks, watched documentaries, and even learned some British history. She wanted to experience the culture and see the famous landmarks she had only seen in pictures, but right now she was feeling embarrassed by her husband's loud behavior. "Rick, maybe you could wear something a little less obvious today?" Linda suggested as they left their hotel that morning. She pointed to a simple t-shirt she had packed for him. "We're guests in their country. Shouldn't we try to blend in a little?" Rick looked at his wife like she had said something crazy. "Blend in? Linda, I'm proud to be American. Why should I hide who I am? These people need to see what real freedom looks like." He adjusted his hat and straightened his flag shirt. "Back home, we don't bow down to kings and queens. We make our own decisions." Linda sighed but didn't argue further. She had learned over the years that once Rick made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. She just hoped the day would go smoothly. They joined a tour group that was heading to see the famous Buckingham Palace. The group was mixed with people from different countries. There was a family from Japan taking pictures of everything, some college students from Germany sharing a map, and an elderly couple from Canada who seemed to know a lot about British history. As they walked, Rick started talking to anyone who would listen. "You know what the problem with Europe is?" he said to the German students. "You guys never learned how to be truly free. In America, we don't need someone else telling us what to do." The students looked confused and a little uncomfortable. They exchanged glances and moved to a different part of the group. Linda pretended she didn't hear and focused on the tour guide who was explaining the history of the area they were walking through. "This street has been here for over 300 years, the tour guide was saying. "Many famous people have walked down this very path." 300 years? Rick said loudly, interrupting. "That's nothing. America has been the greatest country in the world for way longer than that. We showed the whole world how to do democracy right." The tour guide, a polite British man named William, smiled awkwardly. "Well, Britain actually has quite a long history of parliamentary democracy." "Parliamentary?" Rick laughed. "You mean where people still bow to some old lady with a crown? That's not real democracy, friend. Real democracy is what we have in America, where the people are really in charge." Some people in the tour group started whispering to each other. A few looked annoyed, while others seemed curious about this loud American tourist. Linda felt her cheeks getting red with embarrassment. As they continued walking, Rick kept making comparisons between everything they saw and America. When they passed a historic church, he said American churches were more impressive. When they saw a famous statue, he claimed American monuments were bigger and better. When the guide pointed out beautiful old buildings, Rick insisted that American architecture was more modern and practical. "You see that building?" Rick pointed to a government office. "In America, our government buildings represent the people. Here, everything still looks like it's designed to make regular folks feel small and powerless." A woman from the tour group, visiting from Australia, finally spoke up. "Actually, I think these old buildings are quite beautiful. They represent centuries of culture and history." Rick shook his head. "History is fine, but progress is better. America didn't waste time holding on to old ways. We moved forward and became the most powerful nation on earth. That's why everyone wants to come to America. But we're all here visiting Britain," the Australian woman pointed out with a smile. "Doesn't that mean Britain has something special to offer too?" This seemed to annoy Rick even more. "We're just here as tourists looking at old stuff. But when people want a real future, they come to America. When countries need help, they call America. When freedom needs defending, America shows up." Linda tried to change the subject by asking the tour guide about the flowers in the park they were passing. But Rick wasn't finished making his point. "The thing is," he continued, now talking to the whole group whether they wanted to listen or not, Americans understand what real strength looks like. We don't need fancy uniforms and ceremonies to show our power. Our strength comes from our freedom, our independence, and our willingness to fight for what's right. The Japanese family moved further away from Rick, and the elderly Canadian couple started talking quietly to each other. Linda could see that people were getting uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to stop her husband without causing an even bigger scene. As they got closer to Buckingham Palace, Rick's excitement grew. Not because he was impressed by the famous landmark, but because he saw it as an opportunity to prove his points about American superiority. "Wait until you see how these palace guards act," he told the group. "They stand there like statues, pretending to be tough. In America, our military actually does things. They don't just stand around looking pretty for tourists." The tour guide tried to explain the important role of the Royal Guards and their military service, but Rick wasn't interested in listening. He was already planning what he would say when he saw them. "These guards are just for show," Rick continued. "Real soldiers fight real battles. They don't play dress-up for tourists taking pictures." Linda felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She could see the palace gates ahead, and the famous red-uniformed guards standing at their posts. She knew her husband well enough to predict that he was going to do something embarrassing. She just hoped it wouldn't be too bad. The tour group approached the magnificent palace, and Rick's voice got even louder. "Now this is what I'm talking about," he announced. "A perfect example of everything that's wrong with the old world. All this fancy stuff built to make one family feel important while regular people struggle." As they got their first clear view of the Royal Guards, Rick rubbed his hands together like he was preparing for something. "Time to show these people what a real American thinks about their little costume party." Linda grabbed his arm gently. "Rick, please. Can't we just enjoy the tour like everyone else?" But Rick was already walking ahead, his eyes fixed on the guards standing perfectly still at their posts. The other tourists seemed to sense that something was about to happen, and they started keeping their distance from the loud American in the flag shirt. The palace loomed ahead, beautiful and historic, completely unaware that it was about to become the center of an international incident that would be talked about around the world. The magnificent gates of Buckingham Palace came into full view as the tour group walked closer. The famous building looked exactly like it did in all the postcards and movies, with its grand architecture and perfectly maintained grounds. Tourists from around the world were taking pictures and admiring the historic site, but Rick wasn't interested in the beauty or history of the place. His attention was completely focused on something else. Standing perfectly still at their posts were the Royal Guards, wearing their traditional bright red uniforms and tall black hats made of bearskin. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were real soldiers with years of military training and active service. But to Rick, they looked like something completely different. "Would you look at that?" Rick said loudly, pointing directly at the guards. His voice carried across the area where other tourists were quietly admiring the scene. "Linda, are you seeing this? These guys are just standing there like mannequins in a store window." Linda tried to keep her voice low. "Rick, they're doing their job. It's a tradition that goes back hundreds of years." "Tradition?" Rick laughed so loudly that people 20 feet away turned to look at him. "In America, we don't waste our military on playing pretend. Our soldiers do real work, not this dress-up game." A family from Canada who had been part of their tour group moved away, clearly uncomfortable with Rick's behavior. The father whispered something to his wife, and she nodded while glancing back at Rick with concern. Rick didn't notice or didn't care that people were avoiding him. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the guards while making more comments. These toy soldiers probably couldn't handle a real fight if their lives depended on it. "Look at those ridiculous hats. How are you supposed to see anything with that thing on your head?" One of the guards he was focusing on was a man named Sergeant Thompson, who had served 3 tours overseas and had been protecting the royal family for over 10 years. He could hear every word Rick was saying, but his training required him to remain completely motionless and silent. His eyes stared straight ahead, giving no indication that he was listening to the insults. "In Texas," Rick continued, now addressing anyone within earshot, "our security forces actually secure things. They don't just stand around looking pretty for tourists. These guys are probably scared of their own shadows." Linda felt her face getting hot with embarrassment. She noticed that other Americans in the area were looking disgusted by her husband's behavior. A woman wearing a university sweatshirt from California walked over to her. "Excuse me," the woman said quietly, "but could you maybe ask your husband to tone it down a little? He's making all Americans look bad." Linda nodded miserably. "I've been trying, but he doesn't listen." Meanwhile, Rick had moved closer to the guards, completely ignoring the ropes and signs that indicated how close tourists were supposed to get. "Hey there, soldier boy," he called out to Sergeant Thompson. "Can you actually move, or are you just a really good statue?" The sergeant's training was being tested, but he remained perfectly still. His fellow guards nearby also maintained their positions, though Rick didn't realize how much self-control it was taking for them to ignore his taunts. "I bet you've never even been in a real fight," Rick continued. "In America, we teach our military how to actually defend freedom, not how to stand around in fancy costumes." An elderly British gentleman who had been watching the scene finally spoke up. "Excuse me, sir, but these guards are decorated veterans. They've served in Iraq and Afghanistan alongside American forces." Rick turned to the man with a smirk. "Oh, really? And what did they accomplish over there? As far as I know, it was American firepower that got the job done. These guys were probably just along for the ride." The British gentleman's face turned red with anger, but he remained polite. "Sir, I believe you're mistaken about—" "Mistaken?" Rick interrupted. "Friend, I know military when I see it. And this isn't military, this is theater. Pure and simple." More tourists were gathering now, not because they were interested in Rick's opinions, but because they were shocked by his behavior. Some were taking pictures and videos, though not of the guards. They were documenting the scene Rick was creating. Rick noticed the crowd and seemed to think they were there to support him. "See? Even other tourists can tell this whole thing is ridiculous. In America, we respect our military by giving them real jobs, not making them stand around like decorations." A German tourist in the crowd spoke up in accented English. "These guards are protecting the royal family. It's an important job." "Protecting them from what?" Rick laughed. "Aggressive photographers? Scary tourists, please. Real protection happens behind the scenes with real weapons and real training, not with these museum pieces." Linda tried one more time to get her husband to stop. "Rick, people are staring. Can't we just move on to the next part of the tour?" "Let them stare," Rick replied. "Maybe they'll learn something about what real military looks like. These guards wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real American unit." Sergeant Thompson continued to stare straight ahead, but inside he was remembering his time serving alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan. He had great respect for the U.S. military and knew that most Americans would be horrified by what this tourist was saying. The sergeant had lost friends in combat and had earned several medals for his service, but his duty required him to stand silent while being insulted. Rick pulled out his phone again and started making a video. "Folks back home, you're not going to believe this. I'm standing here at the famous Buckingham Palace, and these so-called guards are just standing here like store mannequins while I talk directly to them. Watch this." He held his phone up and spoke loudly toward Sergeant Thompson. "Hey, guard. Can you hear me? I'm talking to you." In America, our soldiers would at least acknowledge when someone is speaking to them. The crowd around Rick was getting larger, but not in a good way. People were whispering to each other and shaking their heads. Several were now filming Rick's behavior, though he seemed to think they were impressed by his boldness. A security officer in civilian clothes had noticed the situation and was moving closer, speaking quietly into a radio. The palace had protocols for handling disruptive tourists, and Rick was quickly becoming a situation that needed management. "You know what the problem is here?" Rick announced to his phone camera and the growing crowd. "These people have been trained to be followers instead of leaders. In America, we teach independence. We teach people to think for themselves and stand up for what they believe in, like what you're doing right now," asked the Canadian father who had been trying to avoid Rick earlier. "Exactly," Rick replied, missing the sarcasm in the man's voice. "I'm not afraid to speak the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable. That's what freedom looks like." The Canadian man shook his head and walked away with his family, but Rick took this as a victory. He was convinced that he was making important points about American superiority and British weakness. Sergeant Thompson, still standing perfectly at attention, was beginning to recognize that this situation was escalating beyond normal tourist behavior. In his years of service at the palace, he had dealt with many visitors who were excited or even rude. But this American tourist was crossing lines that most people respected. Rick stepped even closer to the guard, now almost within arm's reach. I bet you can't even speak English properly, he said directly to Sergeant Thompson's face. Do they teach you real soldiers' skills or just how to stand still and look pretty? The crowd was getting uncomfortable now. Children were being moved away by their parents, and several adults were telling Rick that his behavior was inappropriate. But Rick seemed energized by what he saw as attention and support for his cause. Don't worry, folks, he called out to the crowd while still filming. Someone needs to show these people what American confidence looks like. We didn't win our independence by being polite and quiet. As Rick continued his loud performance, he started walking around the area near the palace gates looking for new ways to make his point. His phone was still recording, and he was clearly enjoying what he thought was his moment of fame. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, but their expressions weren't admiring. They looked shocked and embarrassed for him. You know what really gets me? Rick said to his phone camera while gesturing toward the guards. Back home in America, we honor our veterans with real respect. We give them jobs that matter, not these costume parties. Linda had given up trying to stop her husband and was now standing as far away as possible while still technically being part of the same tour group. She was texting someone on her phone, probably trying to figure out how to end this nightmare. As Rick walked along the fence, he noticed something that made him stop. Near one of the side gates, there was a small memorial display with fresh flowers. The flowers had been placed there by visitors to honor British soldiers who had died serving their country. There was a simple sign explaining that the memorial was maintained by families and friends of fallen service members. Most tourists who saw the memorial either stopped respectfully or quietly took pictures. Some left their own flowers or small tokens of respect. It was a peaceful, solemn spot that reminded everyone of the serious sacrifices made by real soldiers. But Rick saw something completely different when he looked at the memorial. Oh, come on, he said loudly, pointing his phone at the flowers. Now they've got a pity party set up too. Look at this, folks. They're trying to make us feel sorry for soldiers who probably never saw real combat. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. An elderly British woman put her hand over her mouth in shock. Even some of the other American tourists looked horrified. Rick, don't, Linda called out. But her voice was too quiet and he was too focused on his performance. Rick walked right up to the memorial display, still filming himself. You want to know the difference between American military and British military? American soldiers win wars. These guys need our help every single time. He gestured dismissively at the flowers, some of which had small cards attached with personal messages from family members. My grandfather fought in World War II, and he always said the Brits would have been speaking German if we hadn't saved them. The crowd was now completely silent except for a few people whispering urgently to each other. Several tourists had started recording Rick's behavior, but not because they thought it was entertaining. They seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that would be talked about later. Sergeant Thompson, still standing at his post, could see what was happening at the memorial. His jaw tightened slightly, though his training kept him from moving. That memorial included flowers for his own brother, who had died in Afghanistan 2 years earlier while serving alongside American troops. Rick was getting more animated now, feeding off what he thought was attention and approval. These flowers are probably for guys who never even fired their weapons in combat. Real soldiers don't need flower displays. Their victories speak for themselves. Sir, please stop, said a voice from the crowd. It was a middle-aged American man wearing a military cap. You're being disrespectful to fallen soldiers. Rick turned toward the man with a big smile. Finally, another American who gets it. You see what I'm talking about, right? This whole thing is just— No! The veteran interrupted firmly. I served 2 tours in Iraq with British forces. They're some of the bravest soldiers I've ever known. You need to stop this right now. Rick's smile faded, but only for a moment. Look, I respect your service, but you're probably just being polite. Deep down, you know American forces do the heavy lifting. The veteran shook his head in disgust and walked away. But Rick didn't seem to understand that he had just been rejected by someone whose opinion should have mattered to him. Instead, Rick turned back to the memorial flowers with renewed energy. You know what? Someone needs to make a real statement here. He looked around at the crowd and then at his phone camera. Americans don't bow down to anyone. And we don't pretend that participation medals are the same as victory. What happened next shocked everyone who saw it. Rick actually kicked at the memorial flowers, scattering some of them across the ground. The small cards with personal messages fluttered in the breeze and several flower arrangements were knocked over. There, he said to his camera. That's what American independence looks like. We don't worship other people's failures. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Rick seemed to realize that something had changed in the atmosphere around him. Tourists who had been watching from a distance were now staring at him with looks of complete disgust and anger. The British elderly woman who had gasped earlier was now crying quietly. The American veteran who had tried to reason with Rick was walking back toward the scene with several other people, his face red with fury. Linda ran toward her husband, tears streaming down her face. Rick, how could you do that? Those are for people who died serving their country. For the first time all day, Rick looked uncertain. He looked around at the faces surrounding him and seemed to realize that no one was smiling or nodding in approval. Even his phone had stopped recording when he dropped it during his kick at the flowers. I was just making a point about American strength, he stammered. By disrespecting a war memorial? Asked a voice from the crowd. It was the German tourist who had spoken earlier. How is that strong? How is that American? More voices joined in. People from different countries, including other Americans, were expressing their shock and anger at what Rick had done. Some were helping to gather the scattered flowers and cards, treating them with the reverence that Rick had failed to show. Sergeant Thompson, still at his post but now with a clear view of the memorial area, was struggling with his training like never before. Every instinct told him to respond to what had just happened, but his duty required him to remain motionless unless directly threatened. However, Palace security had been watching the entire incident, and they were already moving toward Rick. This was no longer just a disruptive tourist. This was someone who had committed an act of vandalism against a memorial to fallen soldiers. Rick bent down to pick up his phone, and when he stood up, he realized that the crowd around him had grown much larger. But these weren't curious onlookers anymore. They were people who had witnessed something truly offensive and were waiting to see what would happen next. Folks, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Rick said, trying to smile at the crowd, but his voice was shaking now, and his confident attitude from earlier was completely gone. The palace security officers were getting closer, speaking into their radios and coordinating with local police. What had started as an embarrassing display of cultural insensitivity had now become a criminal matter. Linda was frantically trying to repair some of the damaged flower arrangements while apologizing to anyone who would listen. I'm so sorry, she kept saying. He didn't mean it. He's not usually like this. But the damage was done. Videos of the incident were already being uploaded to social media by multiple tourists. Rick's behavior had been captured from several different angles, and the footage would soon be seen by people around the world. Rick looked at Sergeant Thompson, still standing perfectly still at his post, and for the first time seemed to understand that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The guard's silence wasn't weakness or fear. It was professional discipline in the face of behavior that didn't deserve a response. But Rick's day of consequences was just beginning. Sergeant Thompson stood perfectly still at his post, but inside his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions was raging. For 15 years he had served his country with pride and distinction. He had joined the military as a young man of 18, full of dreams about serving something greater than himself. Over the years he had been deployed to some of the most dangerous places in the world, always carrying out his duties with honor and professionalism. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace wasn't just a ceremonial job, despite what tourists like Rick believed. These guards were active soldiers who rotated between ceremonial duties and active military service. Thompson himself had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he had worked closely with American forces. He had genuine respect for the U.S. military and had formed lasting friendships with American soldiers who had fought beside him in difficult conditions. As Rick continued his tirade, Thompson's thoughts went to those American friends. He remembered Staff Sergeant Williams from Ohio, who had saved Thompson's life during an ambush in Kandahar. He thought about Lieutenant Rodriguez from California, who had shared her rations with British troops when supply lines were cut off. These were the Americans that Thompson knew and respected. Brave, professional soldiers who understood that military service was about duty, not showmanship. The contrast between those honorable Americans and the tourist now insulting him couldn't have been sharper. Thompson knew that if Williams or Rodriguez were here, they would be just as disgusted by Rick's behavior as everyone else was. Thompson's training had taught him to remain motionless and silent regardless of provocation. This wasn't just about looking impressive for tourists. It was about discipline and self-control under pressure. In combat situations, the ability to stay calm and focused could mean the difference between life and death. The same mental strength that helped him survive firefights in Afghanistan was now helping him endure Rick's insults. But when Rick kicked the memorial flowers, something changed in Thompson's chest. His brother David had been killed by an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan just 2 years earlier. David had been serving with a joint British-American unit, working to train local police forces. The memorial that Rick had just vandalized included flowers that Thompson himself had placed there for David. Thompson's hands, hanging at his sides, clenched slightly into fists. It was the only outward sign of the rage building inside him. His training held firm, but the emotional cost was enormous. He was watching someone mock the sacrifice of his brother and countless other brave soldiers who had given their lives for their countries. The crowd of tourists around Rick was growing larger and more hostile. Thompson could see other Americans in the group looking ashamed and angry. A family from New York was quietly discussing whether they should intervene. An elderly American veteran was shaking his head in disgust while his wife tried to calm him down. "That man doesn't represent us," Thompson heard an American woman say to her husband. "Real Americans don't act like that." Thompson appreciated hearing that. During his military service, he had learned that every country has its share of good people and troublemakers. Rick didn't represent all Americans any more than a single rude British tourist would represent all of Britain. As palace security began moving toward the scene, Thompson reflected on his years of service. He had been trained by some of the best military instructors in the world. He had learned to handle weapons, navigate dangerous terrain, provide medical aid under fire, and work as part of a team in life-or-death situations. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time was actually one of the easier things his training had prepared him for. What made the guard duty meaningful wasn't the tourist attention or the impressive uniform. It was the knowledge that he was protecting people and representing the best traditions of military service. Every day he stood at his post. He was honoring the memory of soldiers like his brother who couldn't stand there anymore. Thompson had also learned during his military career that true strength often meant restraint. Any fool could throw punches or shout insults. Real strength meant staying calm under pressure, protecting others even when they didn't appreciate it, and maintaining your principles even when others abandoned theirs. Rick was now almost within arm's reach, still filming and making increasingly personal attacks. "I bet you can't even speak for yourself," Rick taunted. "Do they teach you to be this pathetic, or does it come naturally?" Thompson's jaw tightened slightly, but he continued staring straight ahead. He had faced down armed insurgents in mountain caves who were genuinely trying to kill him. A loud tourist with a camera wasn't going to break his composure. In his peripheral vision, Thompson could see his fellow guards maintaining their positions as well. They were all experiencing the same challenge, remaining professional while watching their service and their fallen comrades being mocked by someone who clearly had no understanding of what military service actually meant. Thompson remembered a conversation he'd had with his brother David just before David's final deployment. They had talked about why they served, what motivated them to put their lives on the line for their country. David had said something that Thompson would never forget. "We serve so that people can live in peace, even the people who don't understand what that peace costs." Looking at Rick now, Thompson understood what his brother had meant. Rick was able to travel freely, speak his mind without fear, and enjoy the protection of laws and institutions because soldiers like David had been willing to fight and die for those freedoms. The fact that Rick used those freedoms to insult the very people who protected them was painful. But it was also proof that the system worked. Thompson's military training had also taught him about different types of courage. There was the courage to charge into battle when needed, but there was also the courage to stand firm when others were trying to provoke you. There was the courage to fight when fighting was necessary, but there was also the courage to remain peaceful when violence would only make things worse. Right now, Thompson was demonstrating the second type of courage. Every muscle in his body wanted to respond to Rick's provocations, but his mind and his training kept him focused on his duty. The crowd around Rick was getting more agitated. Thompson could hear people from different countries expressing their disgust with Rick's behavior. Some were asking where palace security was. Others were taking videos to document what was happening. A few were trying to approach Rick directly to tell him to stop. Thompson knew that palace security had protocols for handling situations like this, and they would intervene when appropriate. His job was to maintain his post and trust in the system that had been developed over many years of experience. As Rick's behavior escalated even further, Thompson prepared himself mentally for whatever might happen next. His training had taught him to be ready for anything while appearing completely calm. Whether Rick eventually walked away, or whether security had to remove him, Thompson would remain at his post, doing his duty with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire military career. The tourist might think he was winning some kind of confrontation, but Thompson knew better. Real strength wasn't about making noise or demanding attention. Real strength was about doing your job well, protecting others and honoring the memory of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Rick looked around at the crowd surrounding him, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, he seemed to sense that the atmosphere had changed. The tourists weren't looking at him with curiosity or amusement anymore. Their faces showed a mixture of disgust, anger, and disbelief. Even other Americans in the crowd were shaking their heads and moving away from him. But instead of recognizing that he had gone too far, Rick decided that he needed to do something even more dramatic to prove his point. His mind was racing with ideas about how to create the perfect moment for his video, something that would really show his followers back home what American confidence looked like. "You know what?" Rick announced to his phone camera, which he had picked up and was holding again. "I think it's time to really make a statement here. These guards think they're so tough and disciplined, but let's see how they handle some real American boldness." Linda, who had been trying to quietly fix the damaged memorial flowers, looked up with horror. "Rick, no, please, we need to leave right now." "Leave?" Rick laughed. "Linda, this is the moment we'll remember for the rest of our lives. This is where we show these people what America is really about." The palace security officers were getting closer now, but Rick was too focused on his plan to notice them. He was staring directly at Sergeant Thompson, who continued to stand perfectly still despite everything that had happened. "Here's what we're going to do," Rick said to his camera. "I'm going to show these folks what real leadership looks like. In America, we don't just stand around waiting for orders. We take action." Rick reached up and took off his red hat, the one he had been wearing so proudly all day. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Sergeant Thompson's perfectly still form. "Time to make Britain great again," Rick announced with a grin. What happened next took place in just a few seconds, but to everyone watching it seemed to happen in slow motion. Rick stepped forward and reached up toward Sergeant Thompson's head, clearly intending to place his political hat on top of the guard's traditional military headgear. It was the ultimate act of disrespect, trying to turn a disciplined soldier into a prop for his political statement. The moment Rick's hand made contact with Thompson's uniform, everything changed. For the first time all day, Sergeant Thompson was legally authorized to respond physically. The guard's training had covered this exact scenario many times. Any tourist who made physical contact with a guard, especially around the head and face area, was considered a potential threat that required immediate defensive action. Thompson's response was swift, precise, and completely professional. In one fluid motion that took less than 2 seconds, he executed a defensive technique that he had practiced thousands of times during his military training. Thompson's left hand came up to block and redirect Rick's reaching arm, while his right hand pushed firmly against Rick's shoulder. The technique was designed to neutralize a threat without causing serious injury, but it was also designed to be unmistakably clear about who was in control of the situation. Rick, who had been leaning forward to reach Thompson's head, suddenly found himself off balance and stumbling backward. His phone went flying through the air as he windmilled his arms trying to regain his footing. But Thompson's defensive move had been perfectly calculated, and Rick's momentum carried him several steps backward until he collided with the ornate fountain that stood in the courtyard area. The splash was enormous. Rick disappeared completely under the water for a moment before surfacing, sputtering and gasping. The fountain wasn't deep, but it was deep enough that Rick was now sitting in water up to his chest, completely soaked from head to toe. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unanimous. A cheer went up from tourists of every nationality. People started clapping and shouting approval. Someone yelled, "Well done," in a British accent, while another voice shouted, "That's what you get." in what sounded like Australian English. Even the other Americans in the crowd were applauding. The veteran who had tried to reason with Rick earlier was clapping enthusiastically while his wife took pictures. The family from New York was laughing and giving each other high fives. Rick sat in the fountain, water dripping from his hair and clothes, looking completely shocked by what had just happened. His red hat was floating a few feet away, and his American flag shirt was now see-through and clinging to his overweight frame in an unflattering way. What? What just happened? Rick stammered, looking around at all the smiling faces. You got exactly what you deserved, called out the German tourist who had tried to reason with Rick earlier. More laughter and applause followed. Sergeant Thompson had immediately returned to his position of attention, standing perfectly still with his eyes forward as if nothing had happened. But there was the slightest hint of satisfaction in his expression, visible only to those who looked closely. Palace security officers arrived at the scene within seconds, but instead of rushing to help Rick, they first checked to make sure Thompson was unharmed and that proper protocol had been followed. One senior officer gave Thompson a barely perceptible nod of approval before turning to deal with the situation in the fountain. Rick was struggling to get out of the fountain, slipping on the wet stone edges and making even more of a spectacle of himself. His confident attitude from earlier was completely gone, replaced by confusion and embarrassment. "This is assault," Rick finally managed to shout as he pulled himself out of the water. "That soldier attacked me. I'm going to sue." The crowd's laughter got even louder. Several people shouted back responses. "You attacked him first. You made physical contact." That's what happens when you disrespect the military. Rick's phone, which had landed on the stone pathway when Thompson defended himself, was now completely destroyed. The screen was shattered and water was leaking out of it. All of Rick's video footage of his proud American moment was gone forever. Linda was crying with embarrassment as she helped her soaking husband gather his scattered belongings. "I told you to stop," she whispered. "I told you this would happen." Palace security officers were now surrounding Rick, speaking in calm, professional voices about what would happen next. They explained that physical contact with a royal guard was a serious offense that could result in criminal charges. "But I barely touched him," Rick protested, water still dripping from his clothes. "Sir, you made unwanted physical contact with a member of the Queen's Guard while he was performing his official duties," one of the officers explained patiently. "That constitutes assault under British law." The crowd was still enjoying the show, but now they were also taking pictures and videos of Rick's humiliating situation. The man who had been so eager to film himself insulting British soldiers was now the unwilling star of dozens of videos that would soon be shared around the world. Rick looked back at Sergeant Thompson, who had returned to his perfectly disciplined stance as if nothing had happened. For the first time all day, Rick seemed to understand that he had seriously underestimated the person he had been insulting. The guard hadn't just been standing there because he was weak or afraid. He had been demonstrating a level of self-control and professionalism that Rick couldn't even comprehend. And when Rick had finally crossed the line into physical assault, Thompson's response had been swift, effective, and perfectly within the bounds of his training and authority. Rick's day of humiliation was far from over, but his moment of reckoning with Sergeant Thompson was complete. The quiet, disciplined soldier had delivered the perfect lesson about the difference between real strength and loud bragging. Within minutes of Rick's spectacular encounter with the fountain, Buckingham Palace had transformed from a peaceful tourist destination into the center of a rapidly developing international incident. Palace security officers were coordinating with the Metropolitan Police. Tourists were sharing videos on social media, and news organizations were already picking up the story. Rick stood dripping wet beside the fountain, shivering slightly in the London air as he tried to process what had just happened to him. His confident swagger from earlier in the day had completely vanished, replaced by confusion and growing panic as he began to understand the serious legal trouble he was facing. "Sir, I need you to come with us for questioning," said Inspector Williams, a senior Metropolitan Police officer who had arrived on the scene. "You're being detained on suspicion of assault on a member of the Royal Guard, public disorder, and vandalism of a war memorial." "Assault?" Rick sputtered, water still dripping from his hair. "He's the one who pushed me into the fountain. I'm the victim here." Inspector Williams remained professionally calm. "Sir, multiple witnesses and security cameras show that you made unwanted physical contact with the guard first." His response was a lawful defensive action taken in accordance with his training and authority. The crowd of tourists was still watching with fascination as Rick was led away. Many were holding up phones recording his walk of shame as he squished across the courtyard in his soaking wet clothes. His red hat was still floating in the fountain, forgotten in his hurry to get away from the scene. Linda followed behind her husband, crying quietly and trying to apologize to anyone who would listen. "He's not usually like this," she kept saying. "I don't know what got into him today." As they reached the police vehicle, Rick made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "Do you people know who you're dealing with?" he demanded. "I'm an American citizen. I have rights. I'm going to call the American embassy and tell them how I'm being treated." "Sir, you absolutely have the right to contact your embassy," Inspector Williams replied patiently. "But having American citizenship doesn't exempt you from British law when you're on British soil." The police car pulled away from the palace, but the story was just beginning to spread around the world. Within 30 minutes, the first videos of Rick's confrontation with Sergeant Thompson were appearing on social media platforms. The footage showed everything: Rick's insulting behavior, his vandalism of the memorial, his attempt to put his hat on the guard's head, and his spectacular landing in the fountain. The reaction online was swift and overwhelmingly negative toward Rick. Comments poured in from people around the world, and surprisingly, many of the harshest criticisms came from other Americans who were embarrassed by his behavior. "This idiot doesn't represent us," wrote one user from Texas. "As an American veteran, I'm disgusted by this man's disrespect toward our British allies," posted another. "That Royal Guard showed incredible professionalism. Respect," commented someone from California. By the end of the first hour, hashtags like "God's Ugly American" and "Joey Respect Our Allies" were trending on multiple social media platforms. News outlets from around the world were picking up the story, and Rick's face was becoming internationally famous for all the wrong reasons. At the police station, Rick was learning about the serious legal consequences he was facing. British law took assault on Royal Guards very seriously, and the vandalism of the war memorial added another layer of criminal charges. The duty solicitor who had been assigned to his case explained that he could face significant fines, possible jail time, and deportation from the United Kingdom. "But I was just exercising my free speech," Rick protested. "In America, we have the First Amendment." "Mr. Patterson," the solicitor explained patiently, "free speech doesn't include the right to physically assault people or vandalize memorials. And regardless of American law, you're subject to British law while you're in Britain." Meanwhile, Linda was dealing with her own crisis. She had managed to contact the American embassy, but their response was not what Rick had hoped for. Embassy officials explained that they couldn't intervene in legitimate criminal proceedings, and that American tourists were expected to follow local laws wherever they traveled. "We can provide a list of English solicitors and help with communication," the embassy representative explained, "but we cannot and will not interfere with the British legal system when an American citizen has allegedly committed crimes on British soil." Linda also received a call that made her situation even worse. Rick's employer back in Texas had seen the viral videos and was facing intense backlash from customers and employees. The construction company's owner, who had served in the military himself, was furious about Rick's behavior and wanted to distance the business from the controversy. "Linda, I'm sorry, but I have to let Rick go," his boss explained over the phone. "We've had dozens of customers calling to cancel contracts because they don't want to be associated with someone who disrespected military veterans. It's nothing personal, but I have to protect my business and my other employees." The story was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Major news networks were running segments about the incident, often using it as an example of ugly tourist behavior and its consequences. British newspapers were praising Sergeant Thompson's professionalism while criticizing Rick's actions. American media outlets were also covering the story extensively, but with a focus on how Rick's behavior was damaging America's international reputation. Political commentators from across the spectrum condemned his actions, particularly his disrespect toward military veterans and war memorials. "This man's behavior is the opposite of patriotism," said one commentator on a major American news network. "Real patriots respect the service and sacrifice of military personnel from all allied nations." Back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Thompson had completed his duty shift, and was finally able to relax. His fellow guards and supervisors had all praised his handling of the situation, noting that he had maintained perfect discipline until the moment when defensive action became necessary, and then had responded with exactly the right level of force. "You did everything by the book," his commanding officer told him. That tourist learned the hard way that our guards aren't just ceremonial figures. "You're real soldiers with real training." Thompson appreciated the support, but he was also thinking about the bigger picture. He knew that most Americans weren't like Rick, and he hoped that this incident wouldn't damage the strong relationship between British and American military forces. At the police station, Rick was beginning to understand just how serious his situation had become. The duty solicitor had explained that assault on a royal guard could result in up to 6 months in prison, while the vandalism charges could add additional time and fines. Even if he avoided jail, he was likely to be banned from returning to the United Kingdom for several years. "What about my job?" Rick asked desperately. "What about my reputation back home?" "I'm afraid those consequences are beyond the scope of what the legal system can address," the solicitor replied. "You'll need to deal with those issues separately." From the criminal charges, Rick was finally beginning to grasp that his moment of supposed American pride had turned into a personal disaster that would affect the rest of his life. The videos would never disappear from the internet. His face was now known around the world as an example of tourist behavior at its worst, and he was facing serious legal and financial consequences. Linda spent the evening trying to manage the crisis from their hotel room. She was fielding calls from reporters, dealing with angry messages on social media, and trying to figure out how they would afford the legal fees and potential fines that Rick was facing. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the full story. Rick had gone to London to demonstrate American superiority and strength. Instead, he had shown the world what American ignorance and arrogance looked like, while a quiet British soldier had demonstrated the kind of disciplined professionalism that real strength actually required. The consequences of Rick's few minutes of bad behavior would follow him for years to come, while Sergeant Thompson's measured response had earned him respect and admiration from people around the world. Within 24 hours of Rick's encounter at Buckingham Palace, the video footage had been viewed over 50 million times across all social media platforms. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the original incident to become a global conversation about respect, patriotism, and international behavior. News organizations from every continent were covering the story, but each country seemed to focus on different aspects of what had happened. British media praised Sergeant Thompson's professionalism and restraint, highlighting the fact that he had remained perfectly disciplined until physical contact was made, then responded with exactly the appropriate level of force. "This is what real military training looks like," wrote a columnist for the Times of London. "Not the loud bragging and empty posturing of a tourist seeking attention, but the quiet competence of a professional soldier who knows when to act and when to show restraint." American media coverage was more complex and often painful to watch for anyone who cared about the country's international reputation. Most outlets were highly critical of Rick's behavior, but they also used the incident to discuss broader issues about American tourists abroad and the country's international image. "This man's actions are a reminder that when Americans travel overseas, they represent all of us," said a commentator on CNN. His behavior was not just personally embarrassing, it was nationally embarrassing. Fox News, despite their typical support for Rick's political views, also condemned his actions. "Supporting America doesn't mean disrespecting the military service of our allies," one host explained. "This tourist crossed every line of decency and patriotism." But perhaps the most powerful responses came from American veterans and military families who were appalled by Rick's behavior. Veterans organizations across the United States issued statements condemning his actions and expressing support for Sergeant Thompson and the British military. The American Legion posted a statement on their website. "The behavior displayed by this individual toward our British allies is contrary to everything we stand for as American veterans. We have served alongside British forces in multiple conflicts and have the utmost respect for their professionalism, courage, and sacrifice." The Veterans of Foreign Wars organization added their own condemnation. "Disrespecting a war memorial is an affront to every service member who has made the ultimate sacrifice. regardless of what country they served. This man's actions do not represent American values or American veterans. Social media reactions from individual Americans were equally harsh. The comment sections of news articles were filled with messages from people expressing their embarrassment and anger about Rick's behavior. "I'm a proud American and a veteran, and this man makes me sick," wrote one user. "That British guard showed more class in 5 minutes than this tourist showed in his entire trip. Please don't judge all Americans by this idiot's behavior," pleaded another commenter. Most of us have deep respect for our allies and their military. I've served with British forces overseas. They're some of the bravest, most professional soldiers in the world. "This guy is a disgrace," posted a third. The international reaction was equally strong, but it also revealed something interesting about how the world viewed America. Rather than using Rick's behavior to condemn all Americans, most international observers seemed to understand that he represented a small minority of American tourists. "We've hosted millions of American visitors over the years," said the mayor of London in a statement to the press. "The vast majority are respectful, curious, and wonderful guests. One person's bad behavior doesn't change that." Canadian Prime Minister's office released a diplomatic statement. "Canada values our relationships with both the United States and the United Kingdom. Military service members from all 3 countries have served together with distinction in numerous conflicts. Respect for that service should be universal." Even more interesting were the responses from other countries where American and British forces had served together. Messages poured in from Iraq and Afghanistan, where local officials and citizens who had worked with coalition forces expressed their support for both countries' military personnel. "British and American soldiers fought side by side to help bring peace to our country," said a translated statement from an Afghan provincial governor. "Anyone who disrespects either military disrespects the sacrifices made for our freedom." Meanwhile, Sergeant Thompson found himself at the center of an unexpected wave of international support. Military personnel from dozens of countries sent messages praising his professionalism and restraint. The incident had turned him into a symbol of disciplined military service. Thompson's commanding officer received calls from American military officials expressing their support and apologizing for Rick's behavior. "That tourist doesn't represent the Americans we've served with," said a U.S. Army colonel who had worked with British forces in Afghanistan. "We have nothing but respect for the professionalism your guards showed in that situation." The story also sparked broader conversations about tourism and cultural respect. Travel websites began featuring articles about appropriate behavior when visiting foreign countries, using Rick's incident as a prime example of what not to do. Tourism officials from around the world used the incident as a teaching moment. "When you travel, you're an ambassador for your country," explained a spokesperson for the International Association of Tourism. "Your behavior reflects on everyone who shares your nationality." But perhaps the most significant development was the response from Rick's own community back in Texas. Rather than rallying to support their neighbor, most locals were deeply embarrassed by his behavior and eager to distance themselves from his actions. The local newspaper ran a front-page editorial titled, "This is Not Who We Are," which criticized Rick's behavior while praising American-British military cooperation. "Our community has sent many young men and women to serve overseas," the editorial read. "Many have served alongside British forces and have nothing but respect for their professionalism and courage." Rick's own neighborhood association issued a statement, saying that his actions did not represent their community's values. Several local veterans groups held press conferences to condemn his behavior and express support for Sergeant Thompson. Even Rick's former co-workers were speaking out against him. "He always had strong political opinions," said one person, who had worked construction jobs with Rick. "But we never thought he would do something this disrespectful to military veterans." The viral nature of the story meant that Rick's face and name were now permanently associated with tourist behavior at its worst. Employment websites were already featuring his case as an example of how social media mistakes can destroy career prospects. "This incident will follow him for the rest of his life," explained a career counselor who specialized in reputation management. "Every potential employer who Google searches his name will see these videos. It's a permanent reminder that our actions have permanent consequences." As the global reaction continued to build, one thing became clear. Rick's attempt to demonstrate American superiority had achieved exactly the opposite result. Instead of showing American strength, he had demonstrated American ignorance. Instead of gaining respect for his country, he had damaged its reputation. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thompson's quiet professionalism had earned respect and admiration from people around the world. His disciplined response to provocation had become a symbol of what true strength actually looks like. Not loud bragging and aggressive posturing, but calm competence and appropriate restraint. The incident was becoming a case study in the difference between real patriotism and toxic nationalism, between genuine strength and empty bluster. And the verdict from around the world was unanimous. Rick had failed the test spectacularly, while Sergeant Thompson had passed it with flying colors. 6 months after his humiliating encounter at Buckingham Palace, Rick sat in his small apartment in Austin, Texas, staring at a computer screen. The man who had once confidently proclaimed American superiority to anyone who would listen was now unemployed, largely friendless, and facing the long process of rebuilding his life and reputation. The legal consequences of his actions had been severe but fair. British courts had sentenced him to community service, substantial fines, and a 5-year ban from entering the United Kingdom. More importantly, he had been required to complete cultural sensitivity training and attend classes about military history and international relations. At first, Rick had approached these requirements with resentment and resistance. He viewed them as punishment for expressing his patriotic views. But as the months passed and he learned more about the real history of military cooperation between America and Britain, his perspective began to change. The turning point came during a presentation by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a military historian who specialized in coalition warfare. She had served as a liaison officer between American and British forces in Iraq and had countless stories about soldiers from both countries saving each other's lives. "Mr. Patterson," she had said to Rick after one particularly difficult session, "I understand you believe you were showing American pride. But let me tell you about real American pride." She then told him about Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from El Paso, who had carried a wounded British soldier 2 miles through enemy territory to reach medical evacuation. She told him about Lieutenant Sarah Chen from San Francisco, who had coordinated with British engineers to build schools in Afghan villages. She told him about dozens of American soldiers who had developed lifelong friendships with their British counterparts. "These soldiers understood something you didn't," Dr. Hendricks had explained. "Real strength comes from working together, not from tearing others down. Real patriotism means representing your country with honor, not embarrassing it on the world stage." For the first time since the incident, Rick had listened without arguing back. The community service portion of his sentence had been equally educational. He was assigned to work with a veterans support organization that helped former military personnel from all countries who were struggling with post-service challenges. Many of the veterans he met had served in joint operations with international allies. One of his supervisors was Tom Wilson, a former Marine who had lost his leg in Afghanistan while serving alongside British forces. Tom could have easily dismissed Rick as a hopeless case, but instead he took the time to explain what military service really meant. "You thought that guard was weak because he stood quietly," Tom had told Rick one day as they organized donations for homeless veterans. "But standing quietly while someone insults you takes more strength than fighting back. That guard had the discipline to do his job perfectly even when you were doing everything possible to distract him." Rick began to understand that he had completely misunderstood what he was seeing at Buckingham Palace. Sergeant Thompson wasn't weak or passive. He was demonstrating a level of self-control and professionalism that Rick had never experienced in his own life. As his community service hours accumulated, Rick met veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who had nothing but praise for their British colleagues. They told him stories about British medics who had saved American lives, British bomb disposal experts who had cleared roads for American convoys, and British commanders who had made difficult decisions to protect soldiers from all coalition countries. "Those guys saved my life more than once," said Jerry Martinez, a former Army sergeant who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. "Anyone who disrespects British soldiers is disrespecting the people who brought me home to my family." These conversations forced Rick to confront the reality that his actions at Buckingham Palace hadn't just been rude or embarrassing, they had been deeply hurtful to people. who had genuinely risked their lives for their beliefs in freedom and democracy. The cultural sensitivity. Training also opened Rick's eyes to perspectives he had never considered. He learned about the history of American-British cooperation, from World War II through modern conflicts. He studied the sacrifices made by soldiers from both countries and began to understand why war memorials were so important to military families. One assignment required him to research the stories behind the memorial he had vandalized. Rick spent hours reading about young soldiers who had died far from home, about families who had lost sons and daughters, about the grief and pride that military families carried every day. When he read about Sergeant Thompson's brother David, who had been killed while training Afghan police forces, Rick felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: genuine shame about his actions. It took Rick several weeks to work up the courage to write a letter to Sergeant Thompson. The first dozen drafts were too defensive, making excuses for his behavior or trying to explain his political views. Finally, he wrote something simple and honest. "Sergeant Thompson," the letter read, "I am writing to apologize for my behavior at Buckingham Palace. I now understand that my actions were disrespectful to you personally, to your military service, and to the memory of fallen soldiers, including your brother David. I was ignorant about military service and international cooperation, and I used that ignorance as an excuse for behavior that was simply wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I am working to become a better person and a better American." Rick never received a response to the letter, and he didn't expect one. But writing it had been an important step in his personal journey. As his court-ordered programs came to an end, Rick faced the challenge of rebuilding his life. His viral infamy made finding employment difficult, but it also opened some unexpected doors. The Veterans Organization where he had done community service offered him a paid position helping with their outreach programs. "We think your story could help other people avoid making the same mistakes," explained the program director. "Sometimes the best teachers are people who have learned difficult lessons themselves." Rick also began speaking at schools and community groups about respectful international travel and cultural awareness. His presentations were always difficult and often embarrassing, but they seemed to have a real impact on audiences who could see the genuine remorse in his words. "I thought I was being a proud American," he would tell high school students, "but I was actually being the opposite. I was representing my country badly and disrespecting the military service that makes our freedom possible." Meanwhile, Sergeant Thompson had returned to his regular duties with even greater respect from his colleagues and superiors. The incident had demonstrated his professionalism under extreme provocation, and he was soon promoted to a training role where he helped prepare other soldiers for ceremonial duties. Thompson had received hundreds of letters from around the world, including many from American veterans thanking him for his service and apologizing for Rick's behavior. He had read Rick's apology letter carefully and, while he chose not to respond directly, he was glad to see that the tourist was apparently learning from his mistakes. The broader impact of the incident continued to ripple outward. The story became a case study used in military training programs about maintaining discipline under provocation. It was featured in tourism education programs as an example of cultural insensitivity and its consequences. Most importantly, it had sparked conversations about the difference between genuine patriotism and toxic nationalism. Real patriots, people learned, supported their country by representing it well, respecting allies, and understanding that strength could be demonstrated through restraint and professionalism as much as through aggression. Rick's transformation wasn't complete or perfect. He still struggled with unemployment and social isolation. The internet never forgets, and videos of his humiliating fountain incident would probably follow him forever. But he had learned something valuable about respect, humility, and what it really meant to honor his country. On the first anniversary of the incident, Rick made a donation to a British military charity in honor of Sergeant Thompson's brother David. He also established a small scholarship fund to help American students study abroad and learn about other cultures. "I can't undo what I did," Rick wrote in a blog post that few people read. "But I can try to help other Americans avoid making the same mistakes." Real patriotism means representing your country with honor and respect, especially when you're visiting other nations. "I failed that test badly, but maybe my failure can help others succeed." The story of Rick and Sergeant Thompson had become more than just a viral video about tourist behavior gone wrong. It had become a powerful reminder that actions have consequences, that respect must be earned through behavior rather than demanded through volume, and that true strength often looks like quiet professionalism rather than loud bragging. In the end, both men had been changed by their brief encounter. Rick had been forced to confront his ignorance and begin a difficult journey toward understanding and redemption. Thompson had demonstrated to the world what disciplined military service really looked like, earning respect and admiration that lasted far beyond the incident itself.